So this was one of Steinmetz's greatest contributions, this new conception of industrial research. The laboratory very quickly grew from those 3 people, this is about 1908, to about 30 or 40 people. You'll see in this picture, incidentally, the 2 women, one of them there, but the other there, Edna Mae Best, is the first woman researcher in American industrial research. Again, another policy, both Steinmetz and Whitney were receptive to the idea of women doing research and hired first this Edna Mae Best, later Catherine Blodgett, the famous scientist, came to work. So a laboratory, again, as in the case of Steinmetz, looking beyond the externals and really looking for talent wherever it could find it. You won't see Steinmetz in this picture. He and Whitney did not really get along all that well. And Steinmetz kind of went back to his home laboratory, built a house on Wendell Avenue, went to his own laboratory, and really left the research lab alone. Later, Steinmetz would create an engineering laboratory, the Engineering and Consulting Laboratory, which became another great lab, the General Engineering Laboratory, which again was recombined to form GE's R&D Center. So Steinmetz is the father of both of the roots of modern GE corporate research and development today. Well, in that laboratory that Steinmetz set up and Dr. Whitney ran, some scientists such as Dr. William D. Coolidge quickly proved that this idea of doing some research to be smart enough to make inventions was indeed correct. Dr. Coolidge, a physical chemist, a researcher from MIT, brought down not so much his ideas from MIT, but rather his experimental skill, his stick-to-itiveness, his general understanding of materials, and invented the modern kind of light bulb filament, which is used in just about all incandescent lamps today. And into that laboratory came in 1908 a young man who was kind of on the run from some difficulties, named Irving Langmuir. Langmuir, again, is the other side of this story. I mentioned Steinmetz, the educator, the engineer. Langmuir is the pure science. He is Steinmetz's dream of someone who, by being deeply rooted in pure science, will be smart enough to make great inventions themselves and help others make inventions. His biography is written up very well by a man named Albert Rosenfeld. I encourage anyone to read it, but I just want to bring out 2 biographical facts which cast so much light on his career. First of all, he was encouraged very much as a youth to self-sufficiency. His parents, for example, his father was an insurance executive who took them to Europe. They were in the Alps when I think he was about 12 years old. He asked, "Can I climb alone in the Alps?" You know, most parents would have thrown up their arms in horror and said, "No, of course not. You know, you got to be with a group." His father said, "Well, if you qualify yourselves on the lower trails, you show you can read a map, you can do it." And indeed, at the age of 12 and 13, he was taking solo hikes in the Alps. The second biographical detail which casts light on his character was, you can see his glasses in this picture. When he was young, he had very bad eyesight, and it was a real revelation to him when he was finally fitted for glasses and he looked at a tree which had previously been this blur of green and could distinguish individual leaves. And this is really a theme that goes through his scientific career, is looking at things and distinguishing the individual elements, the atoms, the molecules, the pieces, where other people had only seen a blur, a confusion. Simplifying in some cases, maybe oversimplifying in a few cases, but always seeing the details that others had missed, the crucial details that made understanding possible. Dr. Whitney knew how to use this talent. I mentioned Langmuir came sort of on the run. Dr. Whitney used to hire people by giving them a tryout in the summer. Well, he got a letter from this young man named Langmuir who said, "I'm a teacher at Stevens Tech in New Jersey. I want a good summer job." What Langmuir didn't tell him was he was about to get fired, and he had to get a summer job to start looking around for a new job. Well, Dr. Whitney had a guy from Harvard who he wanted to hire, so he said to Dr. Langmuir, "Sorry, we can't use you." And again, just as a customs office a little while ago, almost the great miss of all time. But fortunately, the guy from Harvard turned Dr. Whitney down, and he went back to this Langmuir, brought him up, and immediately saw that here was somebody who was just a cut above even the very high standards of himself and Dr. Coolidge and Steinmetz and the other scientists who he'd worked with. And he also saw that Langmuir was a very proud man who had not really gotten along very well with previous superiors. And the reason was that those superiors had tried to tell him what to do rather than ask him what to do. Well, Whitney asked him what to do. Langmuir writes a lot of letters to his mother telling how Dr. Whitney's coming to me for advice. And that was the important thing. Langmuir wanted to be used. He didn't his knowledge to be used. He didn't want to be told. So he just fit in perfectly this new assignment, where, as he said, he found much more academic freedom than he'd ever found in a university. Whitney also had an interesting idea. Rather than just leave him in the lab, he sent him down to Pittsfield, Massachusetts once a week to work on electric stoves and thermos bottles with a famous inventor named William Stanley, shown here. Now you might think that might upset a brilliant scientist to be asked to work on stoves and thermos bottles, but Langmuir, again, he wanted his knowledge to be used. He figured out some very important results in the area of heat transfer, which were used widely in that field, and also he was able to apply that back to the electric light bulb. Again, I don't want to make this a technical talk, mainly because there are experts here who know much more than technology, but I show you this piece of technical apparatus because here, at the same time as Steinmetz or Langmuir was learning this heat transfer ideas, he got a new pair of what I like to call his atomic spectacles. Just as those glasses that he wore enabled him to see the details of leaves on a tree, this rather ugly-looking, primitive-looking equipment, really, with the technician Samuel Sweetser, a very important man in the story, in the background, enabled Langmuir to look what was going on inside a light bulb and see what the atoms and molecules were doing, to distinguish, not, of course, by seeing them individually, but by measurements of gas pressures and other characteristics, to really see what was happening on an atomic and molecular level. No one had ever done that before with a light bulb. Nobody had ever bothered because they didn't think it was worth the trouble. From that, he not only invented a better type of light bulb that was 25% more efficient than any previous type, but he developed a whole new theory of what happens when atoms hit surfaces, a theory which was just one of the major contributions to chemistry by any American in the 20th century. He took that theory out of the light bulb and showed that the same kind of theory happened when you had liquid layers in contact with air. And he showed that you could actually measure, again, another form of atomic spectacles here. You could actually measure the thickness of the atom. And I was real excited when one of our scientists, George Gaines, out at the research lab, showed me that I could go home in my kitchen and indeed measure the thickness of molecules by this simple apparatus of Langmuir's. So, the one scientific thing you should remember is this concept of atomic and molecular spectacles, seeing atoms and molecules in a very literal sense due to his very simple experiments and ideas. There was so much more coming out of this light bulb. I'm going to try and wrap up pretty soon, but you could go on forever. Inside that light bulb, he found that not only do you want to look at the atoms and molecules, but you can really see what the electrons are doing. And from that, he made a great improvement in vacuum tubes, which helped bring in the era of vacuum tube electronics and radio. This is him and Dr. Whitney with one of his early vacuum tubes. He tossed off a little idea to Dr. Coolidge about a thing he called a pure electron discharge. Dr. Coolidge put that to work in the X-ray tube and invented the modern Coolidge X-ray tube, which, again, Coolidge certainly deserves the credit because he was the one who really did it, but Langmuir gave him the key idea. So again, looking into a light bulb with atomic and molecular spectacles just had this fantastic cornucopia of results. Bigger vacuum tubes, Langmuir invented an idea called the plasma. I won't try and explain that, but today remains a very hot topic in science and technology. We had a lecturer at the R&D Center just last Thursday giving a talk of how he's invented an atomic and molecular spectacles where you can see an individual atom. And it's an outgrowth of a bit of work which came out of Langmuir and Dr. Albert Hull on the right, their work on plasmas and a thing called a magnetron back in 1920. So really this is just opening up whole new fields of science. It isn't just a single invention or a single discovery, but opening up whole new fields right here in Schenectady, not too far from where we sit today. So I've tried to illustrate where Steinmetz and Langmuir came from and why it was here in Schenectady that they did their work, because this was the place where the founders of the electrical industry wanted to know what their industry was. They had the foresight to develop a research laboratory to find out, and from Steinmetz and Langmuir they got the answers. I just want to finish with the fact that these were not two isolated, well, I don't know, we call them nerds today, or people who sit around the laboratory doing only scientific work. They were very devoted to their community, to the environment, to the various causes that we think, again, we invented in our time. Steinmetz came back to his socialism in 1912, served in the socialist city government. The improvements in the city parks, the city schools, were all spearheaded by his work in George Lund's city government. The one story I want to tell about this is that Steinmetz was head of the schools in Schenectady during the first big energy crisis here when the coal trains weren't running too well in 1919. And people came to him and said, well, we aren't getting enough coal, we're going to have to shut down the schools. Steinmetz said, well, that's a pretty good idea. As soon as every saloon in town is shut down, then I'll start shutting down the schools. And then never did get to the schools, and the schools kept running. So he was a pretty good politician as well, but had a real dedication. And World War I, again, showed another side of both him and Langmuir, I think complementary to both of them. Langmuir, incidentally, started out as a socialist, too. He came to Schenectady, and in one of his first letters says, we're going to have to destroy this free enterprise system and replace it with socialism. But he was quickly converted, unlike Steinmetz, who stuck with it. But World War I came along, and it split these two individuals, as it split many people. The Germans, as you know, applied submarine warfare in World War I. And they started sinking neutral ships and also ships belonging to combatants such as the Lusitania, on which neutral people were riding. Well, most people in the United States said that's terrible and had meetings to protest Germany's bad actions. Steinmetz, who had a very rational approach to all this, perhaps too rational, said no, that what Germany's doing is really not much different than what England is doing with surface ships. And Germany is really more the wave of the future in that they understand science and technology better than England. Everyone looked at him and said, oh, here's a German who's taking the German side. And Steinmetz became terribly unpopular. But again, he would not back down, just as he had not backed down on his socialism, whether that was popular or not. He stuck with this. He lost some important technical positions that he would have had during World War I, but he stuck with this belief. Langmuir, on the other hand, in his quiet way, went down to Nahant, Massachusetts, and invented a gadget for detecting submarines, which actually went into use in the English Channel toward the end of the war in detecting submarines. So, again, different reactions to World War I, but each of them following their principles. Steinmetz, after the war, fortunately regained his popularity again. People realized that it wasn't a question of pro-German, but rather sticking to his principles. And this slide is a reverse version of the other one with the text correct this time. I didn't do that on purpose, but I realized to show that. He turned over the electrical engineering department at Union College to Professor Berg, who carried it on into the great department that it remains today, and ran for state office as state engineer, a post they used to have, and very nearly won on the socialist ticket, came quite closer than any other socialist. So his popularity was restored before his untimely death in 1923. Langmuir, although he abandoned his socialism, remained heavily committed to city politics. He was one of the leaders of the reform movement in the 1930s, which created the city manager type of government in Schenectady. And he was also a leader in preserving the Adirondacks and an early environmentalist before an environmentalist time had come, and later moved from this surface research that's shown here to do some of the first what you might call environmental research in American industry, studies of making it rain and snow and what causes rain and snow. His colleague Vincent Schaefer made the first rainstorm. So he really pioneered a whole new area that an industry might actually do environmental research, and ended his career enmeshed in controversy with the Weather Bureau about whether if you seeded the clouds in New Mexico you could make it rain in the Ohio valleys. Langmuir said yes, and the Weather Bureau said no. It's really kind of funny. At the same time, Langmuir was writing a famous paper called Pathological Science, saying how some scientists get so attached to their crazy ideas that they follow them no matter how many people disagree. And at the same time, he was doing the very thing with his slightly quack ideas about artificial precipitation. But again, the point I'm trying to make is these were people who got behind something they believed in, their principles, and never let them go. So I just want to conclude with this other picture. This is the other picture that shows the two of them together, and appropriately with the five individuals who really made Schenectady, I think, really one of the world's great science and engineering centers at that in their time. From left, William Coolidge, who I mentioned, inventor of the modern X-ray tube, Dr. Whitney, Thomas Edison, who never lived here but visited here occasionally, and certainly it was his moving his factory here which got it all started, Steinmetz and Langmuir. One of the symbols of significance of this picture, this is the only picture I've ever seen where the president of GE stands in the second row. Mr. Swope, second from the right, who knew that he really took a backseat to these five geniuses. So on that message of the five geniuses, I want to leave you with the answers to those questions, that the reason that these two people got to be who they were is certainly tied very closely to their individual life and psychology. But the reason they did it here in Schenectady was because the people who created a factory here had the foresight to realize that you don't separate the factory from the brains, but this combination of factory, brains, and an idea that your industry may be a little larger than even you think it is can make a city which not only lights and halls the world, but lights the life of science and engineering for many, many generations to come. Thank you.
In the picture of the first picture of the staff of R&D Center,
Yeah.
What were the children doing in the?
Those are messengers. They instead of calling on the phone, they give somebody a message and they carry it around the place.
What was the nature of Steinmetz's physical disability?
He was born, I'm really not sure, they use the word hunchback, which I'm not sure is a correct medical term, but he was born with a congenital deformity to his back that his father had the same thing, and there's a complicated story that he had decided not to have children, but then his brother died and he married his brother's wife, and one thing led to another, and he did, and that's why Steinmetz didn't have children, but it was a congenital deformity. He was believed that it had been passed from his father to him.
I think he was asked a question one time why he was an atheist. He said, well, he said, if there was a God, would they put a head like mine on these shoulders?
Now, how did these people interact with births and deaths? Edison was earlier.
Yeah, Edison was about...
And Langmuir was last. I was wondering how they interacted over those ages.
They each a separate generation. Edison in 1847, he's 20 years before Steinmetz was 1865, and then Langmuir is 1886 at birth, so they were 20 years apart in birth. Edison lived until 1932, so he actually outlived Steinmetz by about 9 years, and Langmuir lived up in 1957 into the 50s, so they were really three separate generations. You almost say the generation of inventor, Edison, of engineer and mathematician Steinmetz, and then scientist Langmuir. They each sort of fulfilled the previous generation's aspirations.
Was Steinmetz recognized by the electrical profession?
Yes, he was very highly recognized by what was then called the AIEE, now the IEEE. Was the president of the AIEE, and his big recognition, though, was not so much from the electrical profession, but when Harvard gave him an honorary degree, and the president of Harvard said the greatest electrical expert in America and therefore the world, which was really kind of wrong on two counts. He wasn't necessarily the greatest American, and that didn't make him the greatest in the world necessarily in those days, but he was, that sort of made him recognized. And from then on, whenever the newspapers wanted to consult any electrical expert, he was the guy. But he was also highly regarded within the technical community as well.
One of the first talks that I heard in Schenectady was by Irving Langmuir, who talked to some of us who lived at the YMCA, and he told how on a trip to Sweden, I guess it was, Norway or Sweden, he discovered people skiing, which was unknown to him at the time, and so he got a hold of a pair of skis and brought them home, and he may have been the first skier in the United States, certainly one of the first.
He was a pioneer. Yeah, I was talking to Guy Suits about this recently, who was involved in this in the 30s, which is a little later. But yeah, Langmuir and Vince Schaefer and the other group at the GE labs and some of the engineers were really some of the pioneers in this area. There were other people doing it. Guy Suits tells the story of how they would go up north, and at that time, there'd be people walking up the hills, and there were no tows or anything. But there was a small group, and he was indeed one of the pioneers. It just, you could say so many things about Langmuir. He flew his own plane. He founded the first Boy Scout troop in Schenectady. He would swim a couple miles on Lake George early mornings, and just an incredible guy. Just so much energy that he was trying to use up.
I suspected that Steinmetz had made a deliberate decision not to have children,
Yes.
and that was true. Right?
Yes, he adopted a family, the Hades.
Yeah.
Yes, that's again.
Yeah, she made it clear, right?
She was at an earlier one of my talks, which made me even more nervous than talking to Scoop. That's the trouble with these guys. It's actually nice. There's always someone, again, as a nice story you had, there's someone in this audience who knows a story about one of these people you haven't heard. There's no end. It's kind of a bottomless well of information about these people. There's a side or an aspect to them. And again, there's very few people like that who just have so many dimensions. This whole story about Steinmetz's family, one could give a lecture about that, and his adopted family, and his ideas about family life and various things going back to his youth.
I take a little exception to brain making. The time that they were seeding towels in Arizona was spring, summer, mainly summer. And the Strongs family used to like to camp. Every weekend, that whole summer long, it poured rain. On the other hand, the Midwest was clear. And there was a group out there I know about who were building one of these fundamentalist religious temples. And the guy told me, you know, we wanted to build that temple this summer, and the Lord made it sunshine every weekend. It was very tempting to say, the Lord will flame you. Any more questions?
How did Coolidge interact with these other people?
He and Langmuir worked very closely together. Steinmetz stayed kind of aloof from the research laboratory group. I don't really understand why, but he felt they were a little too more physics and chemistry for his taste, and not quite enough devoted to the electrical theory. So, but Coolidge and Langmuir worked quite closely together. I mentioned the X-ray tube and the light bulb area. And Dr. Coolidge became the director of the laboratory, and he made Langmuir, well, I guess Whitney had already done this. Langmuir was made an assistant director and given nobody to direct because he wasn't really his manager. So that kept their relationship. They weren't really in competition for the top spot. Often you would have, if you had two bright guys like that and the old director retired, you could have a collision. But they had, as far as I know, had no problem with that arrangement.
On Wendell Avenue, there's some kind of an inscription on a rock there, or whatever it is, a memorial. What kind of, was that where he lived?
Yes, he had a home, a fascinating home. He had this big, I would say big ugly house. A lot of people could argue on this, but it had a conservatory in the back of it, and it had an electrical laboratory where people claimed that they saw all kinds of strange lights at night and lightning flashes and things. And he had his Gila monster and his cacti and everything. So it was like a museum. And there was a big movement after he died to make that into a museum and preserve it, but I guess that coincided with the Depression and it was hard to raise any money.
Well, they also discovered that there was really nothing much to display except drawings that nobody would understand.
Yeah, maybe it sounded like a more interesting place than it was, I guess. Yeah, because people had all these stories of these strange things that went on in it.
Is the story untrue that he wanted the house destroyed after his death?
I don't believe he did it. As I've heard, again, this is maybe others know more, but I understood that he had left it and there was a group that was raising money to have it preserved, and then that they never raised enough money or there wasn't enough. But I don't think he had any reason for wanting to destroy it.
One thing I remember about Langmuir when I started in the GE, you'd call him up, he was then about 74, you'd call him up and ask him any question, he'd rewrite all. Even obscure mathematics.
Some of the bricks go in the co-op building?
Yeah, he was a
If you really want to get a close contact to Steinmetz, you go up and buy at the co-op, because some of the bricks from that house were salvaged. Socialism continues on with the co-op.
Thanks very much for